The poor girl begged for a job, but the cowboy said, "I need a wife,
Can I
not
help
a
you,
servant."
ma'am?
The Wyoming wind swept across the barren fields, carrying a veil of red dust that hung like smoke. It was the
You can
year
stay the night.
1875. The
Thank
sun
you,
leaned
sir.
low, its fiery glow brushing over the faded hills of grass. In front of the weathered wooden
Is
gate
anyone
of Diamond
here?
Y Ranch, a young woman
I need
stood
work,
still.
please.
Her
I'll
dress
do
was warm and
anything.
dusty, her wool scarf torn and
I don't need
wrapped
a
tight around
servant.
her
I need a
shoulders.
wife.
The wind tangled her hair, lifting strands damp with sweat. Her small hands clutched a cloth bag as if letting go would mean dropping her last piece of hope. She drew in a shaky breath, her voice trembling in the wind. "Sir, I just need a job. I can cook, wash, clean. I don't need any pay. I just need a place to stay." No answer came, only the soft chime of horse bells somewhere behind the barn. Then, through the haze of dust, a figure appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, walking slow and steady. The cowboy moved toward her, his boots heavy with dirt, each step echoing dry against the ground. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over half his sunburned face, the sunset burning behind him so that he seemed part of the red-gold earth itself. He stopped by the gate, squinting at the trembling stranger before him. His gaze was calm, but beneath it lay a deep loneliness, the kind only a man who had lived too long in silence could understand. He wiped his oil-stained hands, his voice rough and low, filling the empty air. "I don't need a servant." The girl froze, her breath caught in her throat. The cowboy watched her another moment, then spoke slowly, each word dropping heavy into the wind. "I need a wife." The world went still. The wind quieted. Dust floated down like tiny sparks in the last light of day. The girl stared at him, unsure if she had heard right. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. He said nothing more, just looked at her, steady and unreadable. There they stood, two souls in the vast silence of the prairie, one desperate for shelter, the other searching for the last trace of warmth life could offer. And in that ordinary moment where wind, dust, and silence met, fate quietly shifted. One sentence, one sunset, and a story neither of them could have foreseen began to unfold. The sun sank behind the distant hills, leaving a faint amber glow that blended into the red dust. The land was dry to the point of cracking. The wind scraped across the skin, and only the creak of an old windmill broke the vast stillness. In that desolate frame of the late 19th century, a small figure walked along a dirt road marked by the fading tracks of horses. Jessie Keller, a young woman who had fled St. Louis, carrying a worn cloth bag and a heart splintered by fear. For 3 weeks, she hadn't slept through a single night, nor eaten a proper meal. Behind her was a past she tried to bury. Ahead was a land she'd only heard described in harsh whispers. Wyoming, where men spoke little, and the wind spoke more than people did. When she saw the wooden sign swaying at the gate, Diamond Y Ranch, Jessie stopped. The tall gate's paint was peeling, and from inside came the lowing of cattle and the steady rhythm of a hammer. She knew this was it. Either she stayed, or she'd collapse somewhere on the road before dawn. She knocked gently on the gate, her voice hoarse from thirst. After a moment, a man emerged from the direction of the stables. He was tall, broad, and moved with a quiet certainty. His cowboy hat cast a shadow across half his face, his pale blue eyes marked by fatigue. Brody Yates, the owner of the ranch, a man who had lived alone since his father's death, speaking mostly to the wind and his horses. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "I need work." "Sir," Jessie replied, her voice trembling like the wind. "I can cook, do laundry, mend clothes. I don't need money, only food and a place to sleep." Brody studied her for a long while. Before him wasn't a beggar, but someone who had come too far, fought too long, just to stay alive. Slowly, he nodded. "There's an empty room above the barn. You can stay tonight. Get some food before dark." Jessie bowed her head, her eyes stinging with tears. He led her across the yard, the wind pushing against the doors, dust swirling in the fading light. Inside the wooden house, the air was unexpectedly warm. The glow of an oil lamp danced on the walls. The scent of beef stew lingered in the air. Brody ladled a bowl and set it before her, then quietly sat across the table. She ate slowly, each spoonful careful, as though rushing might shatter the fragile piece she'd found. When he showed her the way to the small room upstairs, she whispered, "Thank you, sir," but he only nodded. The room was bare, a small bed, an old stove, a single oil lamp on the table. Jessie closed the door and stood still, watching the flame flicker. Something inside her broke not in fear, but in fragile relief. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressed a hand to her chest, and listened to her heartbeat in the quiet room. Outside, the wind still howled through the fences, but inside, That tiny flame, the soft yellow light of the lamp, made her believe, for the first time in weeks, that she might live another day. And perhaps that very night, as the firelight flickered through the window and the cowboy's shadow passed silently across the yard, their fates began to move quietly, but irreversibly. One word, one shelter, and two lonely hearts finding each other in a land that never promised anything. Part 1. Between the ranch gate and desperation. Evening fell slowly over the Wyoming plains, the fading sun casting a reddish-golden glow across the dry dunes, as if the whole world had been brushed with fire and dust. The wind blew in harsh bursts, curling the dirt into small whirlwinds before letting them vanish into the emptiness. Somewhere in the distance, the lowing of cattle mingled with the metallic clang of tools. The road to Diamond Y Ranch lay deserted except for one lone figure. Walking with heavy, weary steps, Jessie Keller had come too far. The heels of her boots were worn down, the leather cracked and bleeding her feet. On her shoulder hung a torn cloth bag holding the last pieces of her life: a broken wooden comb, a handkerchief her mother once gave her, and a few coins that clinked faintly when she moved. She stopped before the ranch gate, where two weathered posts bore the faded carving of the letter Y, resting a trembling hand on the wood. She drew in a deep breath. The gate felt cold and rough beneath her cracked fingers. The silence was haunting. All around her stretched endless grassland, scattered trees, and a broken windmill standing crooked against the red sky. The wind whipped through her hair, tossing dust into her clothes until her dress clung to her legs. Softly, she called out, Is anyone here?" No answer came, only the hiss of the wind slipping through the wooden fence. Jessie bit her lip, gathering what courage she had left, and tried again. "Please, let me work for you. I can cook, clean. I only need a place to stay and something to eat, sir." This time, her voice broke apart in the wind, but from the other side of the gate came a faint sound. Out of the shadows of the barn, a man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt streaked with dust, his boots thudding dryly against the earth. The brim of his cowboy hat cast a dark line across half his face, revealing only a pair of cool blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Brody Yates stopped at the gate, his strong hands still dusted with bits of hay. He studied the girl standing before him, thin, worn, her face pale with exhaustion, but her gaze still holding a trace of pride. Not the eyes of a beggar, but of someone clinging desperately to the last thread of hope. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, his voice low and roughened by wind and tobacco. Jessie lowered her head, hesitating. "From the east," she whispered. "I've been walking for days. No one will take me anymore. I just need work, any kind of work." Brody said nothing. The wind rose again, swirling dust around them. The sunset poured through the gap in the gate, painting her pale cheeks in shades of red. She stood motionless, clutching her bag, her lips trembling. In that fragile moment, strength and helplessness wove together, thin as a single strand of thread. He didn't answer right away. After a long pause, his voice came dry, but not cold. "You've come a long way. To look for work in a place this empty." She nodded, swallowing hard. Her voice was barely a whisper, far enough that there's no road back. The air thickened with those words. Something flickered in Brody's eyes. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. He had once stood where she was now, caught between moving on in loneliness or daring to believe in something again. "All right," he said quietly. "There's an empty room above the barn. You can stay the night." Jessie lifted her gaze. In her eyes, a faint light returned like an oil lamp that had nearly gone out but found a breath of flame again. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head deeply and murmured, "Thank you, sir." Brody unlatched the gate. The hinges creaked softly into the silence as she stepped through. The evening wind rose once more, tossing her tangled hair and scattering dust behind her. In that crimson twilight, a desperate girl had found a place to rest, and a hardened man had opened the first door of his heart. Neither spoke another word, but both felt it right there at the quiet ranch gate. Something had begun to move between them. Gentle as the wind, steady as the earth. Part 2, The Man and His Strange Words. The last light of day fell slanted across the ranch yard, stretching into thin golden bands over the dirt. Red dust hung in the air, glowing softly as sunlight pierced through. Beautiful, but lonely. Jessie stood at the edge of the porch, her hand gripping the strap of her bag, her anxious eyes following the man who had just opened the gate for her. She didn't know whether to step forward or stay still, didn't know what waited for her behind that quiet, unreadable gaze. Brody stopped beside a wooden post, his shadow long against the ground. He said nothing at first, only looked at the frail woman before him, her tangled hair, her sunburned face streaked with road dust, her weary eyes that still somehow held a faint light. Something in that gaze caught him off guard. A hidden courage beneath the exhaustion. A fragile spark he hadn't seen in anyone for years. The wind swept through, brushing the reins that hung from the post, making them jingle faintly. The silence was so deep they could hear each other's breathing. Brody pulled off his gloves, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked straight at her. His voice, roughened by wind and dust, broke the stillness. "How long have you been walking?" 3 weeks. "Sir," Jesse replied softly. "From St. Louis." He nodded slightly, his eyes shifting as he asked again. "You got anyone left?" "No, it's just me now." A long pause stretched between them. From the distant fields came the lowing of cattle, the creak of the stable door. Jessie lowered her head, her heart thudding painfully fast, afraid he might turn her away, afraid she'd have to keep walking. On and on, until her strength finally gave out. Then Brody exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the dust of many lonely years. He stepped closer, stopping just a few paces from her. The sunlight caught his face, tracing the hard lines of his tanned cheek beneath the brim of his hat. "You said you can cook, wash, mend clothes." Jesse nodded. "Yes, sir. I can do anything. I don't need much, just shelter and food." The words left her like a prayer. Her voice trembled, catching at the end, as though she were trying to hide her fear. Brody stared at her, unblinking, as if weighing something beyond work, something that didn't belong to reason. Then he spoke, slow and steady, his deep voice rolling through the quiet yard. "I don't need a servant." Jessie froze, her eyes lifting in shock. Light shimmered in them like fragile glass beneath the sun. Brody stood still, his face calm, though something faint stirred in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. He continued, even slower this time, his voice low enough that the wind seemed to stop to listen. "I need a wife." The air went still. The wind died. Dust drifted quietly to the ground. Even the old windmill in the distance seemed to pause, as though the whole dry land held its breath. Jessie stepped back slightly, gripping her bag until her knuckles turned white. She didn't understand, was this an insult, or a truth so bare it hurt to hear? Her lips trembled as she stammered. What did you say?" Brody didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, his gaze softening, though a shadow of sadness lingered there. "I've lived here alone since my father passed. This ranch doesn't lack work, but I don't need another hand. I need someone who knows how to live, how to speak, how to keep a fire burning in the house. I don't need a servant. I need someone to stay." The words were plain, unadorned, but they cut through Jessie's chest like a cold gust of air. She didn't know whether to cry or to smile. In his dry, steady tone, she heard not command, but emptiness, the hollow ache of a man who hadn't had anyone waiting for him in a very long time. A soft breeze returned, carrying the scent of hay and the warmth of the earth. Jessie lowered her head. Her lips parted, but no words came. Brody only watched her, no pressure, no explanation, just silence. In the amber light of dusk, they stood facing each other in the ranch yard, a woman trembling with fear, and a man quiet with loneliness. And in that barren stillness, amid the earth, the wind, and the dust, his rough-sounding words planted a seed, something fragile, yet profoundly deep. That sentence would remain, lingering like the last light of sunset, illuminating two hearts that had long since closed themselves to the world. Part 3. The first night at Diamond Y. Night wind swept across the Wyoming plains, slipping through the cracks of the old wooden walls of the Diamond Y ranch. The windmill creaked in rhythm with the steady hum of crickets. Outside, the sky was thick and dark, scattered with cold. Distant stars watching quietly over the faint breaths of the girl who had finally found a place to rest after nearly collapsing on her journey. Jessie followed behind Brody Yates, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. With every step, the dry wind kicked up red dust, coating the hem of her dress. The light from the oil lamp in Brody's hand flickered, throwing trembling shapes across the barn walls and the cobwebbed windows. The air carried the mingled scents of hay, old timber, and earth, a warm, grounding fragrance so different from the musty dampness of the roadside lodgings she had hidden in along the way. "Your room's upstairs," Brody said, his voice low and rough, almost a whisper. "It's small, but warm enough. There's a little stove and a water barrel by the door. If you need anything, call me." Jessie nodded faintly, not daring to meet his eyes. "Yes, thank you." "Sir." He didn't answer, just gave a small nod and bent down to stir the fire in the iron stove. The kindling crackled, sending tiny sparks floating into the air. She stood still, watching him. In the firelight, his face became clearer, the rugged lines, the quiet strength, not harsh, but marked by years of solitude. He looked like a man who had lived too long in silence, side by side with the wind and the earth, unsure what to do now that another human being had stepped into that silence. "Have you eaten?" he asked, his gaze still on the fire. She shook her head, clutching her bag strap. I only had some dry bread." Brody poured water into a pot, dropped in a few slices of salted meat and some dried herbs, and stirred. "Got a bit of stew left. It's not much, but it's hot." "Sit down." Jesse stepped carefully to the wooden table and sat on a creaky chair. The faint aroma of the stew filled the room, making her empty stomach tighten. When Brody set the bowl in front of her, she looked up to thank him, but his eyes caught hers, and she only managed a small nod. His eyes were pale blue and still, like a winter lake reflecting everything, revealing nothing. "Eat," he said, and sat across from her. Jesse lifted the spoon, her hand trembling. For the first time in weeks, she smelled something other than dust and dry grass. The first sip slid down her throat like a slow flame, spreading warmth through her chest until she had to stop and take a deep breath to keep from crying. Brody sat quietly, elbows resting on the table, eyes fixed on the fire. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry, didn't judge. He was simply there, close enough for her to feel safe, but distant enough to let her breathe. After a while, Jessie set the spoon down and murmured, her voice soft as the wind. "It's been a long time since I've had a hot meal." Brody didn't answer right away. He lifted the kettle, poured a little more water into the pot, and said quietly, "Out here, people get used to the cold, but a warm meal reminds you that you're still alive." She lowered her head, her lips trembling. Such a simple thing to say, but it struck deep, into the place inside her that had burned quietly beneath the fear all along. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a steadier tone. Brody looked at her briefly, then nodded. "Get some rest. There's a blanket and a lamp in your room. You'll need both." He stood, heading for the door. The lamplight brushed his shoulder in a soft golden arc. Before stepping out, he paused and turned back. "You don't have to call me, sir. Just Brody will do." The door closed behind him, leaving Jessie alone with the small, steady fire. She sat still for a long while, listening to the wind whistle through the window and the gentle sound of horses shifting in the stalls below. The firelight cast her shadow on the wall thin, fragile, swaying like it might vanish at any moment. She climbed the old wooden stairs, each step creaking underfoot. The room was smaller than she expected, but clean. A wooden bed with a thin mattress, a folded wool blanket, and a little table by the window with the oil lamp Brody had mentioned. She lit it. The soft yellow glow filled the space. Warm and tender, Jessie sat on the bed, running her fingers across the coarse wool blanket. The faint scent of smoke lingered, not unpleasant, but comforting, human. The wind still howled outside, but in here, only the quiet crackle of fire remained. She removed her shoes, set her bag down, and lay back, staring at the wooden ceiling above. Memories flickered, nights spent curled in abandoned barns, hiding in the woods, the hunger and fear pressing in from all sides. She had thought there was no place left in the world for her. Yet here, in this harsh land, a stranger had given her a bowl of soup, a place to sleep, and a light. Tears came, unbidden, not of sorrow, but of release. Each drop carried away a layer of frozen fear that had bound her for so long. She pulled the blanket up to her chest and closed her eyes. Warmth rose from the stove below, mingling with the scent of wood and smoke. For the first time in weeks, her body began to relax. The wind still blew, but now it sounded more like a lullaby. In the main house, Brody hadn't gone to bed. He sat at the table, a cup of cold coffee in hand, watching the dim glow of a lamp in the barn through the window. That small light, faint and flickering, somehow made the empty yard feel less lonely. He took a slow sip and almost smiled, a rare expression, as if even he didn't understand why. Upstairs, Jessie stirred in her sleep. Her lips curved slightly, the faintest trace of a smile, whether it was dream or peace. Her face looked serene. The lamplight glowed through the window, casting a soft shimmer into the dark sky like a quiet message that even in barren lands, gentle light still lives, enough for someone to believe again. Before dawn, the ranch was wrapped in silence. Only the sound of the girl's steady breathing mingled with the rhythm of the wind outside. And in that fragile hour where warmth met breath and fear melted into calm, something quietly miraculous had taken root. In a land of dust and solitude, a heart had found peace again. A bowl of warm soup, a small room, an oil lamp. 3 simple things, yet enough to save a soul standing at the edge of despair. And that night, as Jessie dreamed, she smiled for the first time. She didn't dream of the past. She dreamed of light. Part 4. The Days Beneath a Cowboy's Roof. Dawn in Wyoming was never loud like in the East. It arrived quietly slow, hesitant, as though afraid to wake the sleeping land. The first light slipped through a veil of silver mist, crawling softly over the wooden roof and spilling across the golden fields that stretched to the hills. The air carried the scent of dry grass, cow's milk, and the faint ash from last night's fire and earthy fragrance of the Wild West, rough yet strangely comforting. Jesse woke before sunrise. She still wasn't used to the stillness of Diamond Y Ranch, where every sound seemed to echo clearly: the horses stamping in the stalls, the wind weaving through wooden cracks, the soft whistle of a boiling kettle. Each noise was part of a rhythm she had never known before. She rose, wrapped her worn wool scarf around her shoulders, and lit the stove. The blue flame danced, warming her cold fingers. She set a pot of water to boil, added cornmeal and milk, and stirred gently. A simple, soft fragrance filled the small wooden kitchen, bringing with it a rare sense of ease. When Brody stepped inside, Jesse was crouched on the floor, rag in hand, wiping the boards. Her hair was tied back messily, her sleeves rolled, her hands roughened by work. He stopped in the doorway, saying nothing. Morning light spilled in behind him, stretching his shadow long across the floor. She hadn't noticed him yet. The house was silent except for the sound of her scrubbing and the wind sighing at the door. Brody slowly set his hat on the table, his pale blue eyes following her quiet movements, the way she wrung the cloth, brushed hair from her eyes, and polished the floor with patient care. It had been a long time since a woman's hands had touched this house, since his mother passed. Then his father. Brody had lived with only the fields and the horses. He'd never thought to hire help, never cared if the floors gathered dust. But watching that thin girl kneel there, quietly bringing light into the corners of his silent home, he realized the place no longer felt so hollow. "You're up early," he said, his rough voice softer than usual. Jesse startled, nearly dropping the rag. "Oh, I'm used to it. Back where I was. I had to wake before the sun. No need to rush. Days are long out here." She smiled faintly, eyes lowered. "I just wanted to do something in return." He didn't reply. He went to the table, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and sat. Jesse set her broom aside, ladled the cornmeal porridge into 2 stone bowls, and hesitated. "I made a little porridge. I'm not sure it tastes right." Brody looked at the steaming bowl, the golden light reflecting off its surface. He took a spoonful, slightly bland, a little too thick, but it tasted of effort, of sincerity. He nodded once. "Not bad." Jesse lowered her head. 3 simple words, yet they lifted something heavy from her chest. No one had ever thanked her for a meal before, only shouted, ordered, or scolded. That small kindness almost brought her to tears. After breakfast, she carried blankets out to dry, swept the yard, gathered wood. Brody didn't have to ask, she simply did what needed to be done. He went to the stables, and she followed later, rolling up her sleeves to help cut hay and fetch water for the horses. The work was rough, but she endured it quietly, sometimes pausing to look up at the vast blue sky. By noon, when the sun hung high, Brody sat on the porch railing, watching Jesse mend his coat, a thick brown one, frayed at the sleeves. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stitched, but each movement was careful and precise. He found himself strangely moved. In those delicate hands lived a strength he hadn't seen before, the strength of someone who worked, not for reward, but out of quiet gratitude. "That old thing's not worth fixing," he said from the porch. She looked up, her hazel eyes warm in the light. "Old things can last, if you take care of them." He smiled barely, but it was there. "You're right." When evening came, Jesse lit the fire. The smell of baking bread drifted through the cabin. Brody passed by, stopping at the kitchen door, watching her knead dough with small, steady hands, sleeves rolled high, a few strands of hair falling across her face. She didn't notice him. The firelight glowed on her skin, soft and alive. Something in him tightened a quiet ache he couldn't name. When the bread was done, Jesse set it on the table, then stepped outside to fetch water. When she returned, she froze for a moment. Brody had already cut the loaf in half, setting one portion neatly on a plate beside a cup of warm milk for her. No words, no glances, just a quiet gesture and a faint curl of steam rising between them. She stood still, looking at the simple offering. In every place she had worked before, the masters ate first, servants took what was left. But here, this silent man shared the bread as if it were warmth itself, a small act, but one that told her everything. He trusted her. Brody stepped back into the room, pretending not to notice her hesitation. "Eat up. Bread's best when it's warm." Jesse nodded gently, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you." Brody. That evening, they ate in silence, not an awkward one, but calm and steady. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grass, brushing the old curtains. The oil lamp flickered, casting the faint image of two figures across the walls, a quiet cowboy and a weary girl slowly learning how to smile again. After dinner, Brody put on his coat and stepped onto the porch for a smoke. Jesse cleaned the dishes, the lamplight tracing the delicate lines of her face. When he came back in, she was drying her hands with a cloth. He paused by the table. "You've done enough for today," he said softly. "No one's asking you to work that hard." She looked at him, part gratitude, part shyness. "I just want to feel useful, to feel like I'm doing something that matters." Brody took a slow breath, exhaled the smoke, and murmured, "No one's useless if they're living for someone else." The words stilled her. She had never thought of life that way. For so long, Jesse had lived out of fear of hunger, fear of being caught, fear of being forgotten. Living for someone was a luxury she never imagined she could understand. Yet, in that warm light, standing inside this wooden house, she felt something shift. The air no longer swallowed her breath. Night deepened. Brody locked the doors, dimmed the lamps. She stood by the stairs and whispered a "good night." He nodded. "Sleep well. The wind'll be rough tomorrow." She smiled, climbing the stairs with a quiet sense of peace. In her room, she looked at the oil lamp's soft glow and gently touched the corner of the coat she had mended. A quiet man, a broken girl, two strangers sharing one wooden roof in the middle of nowhere. And when Brody placed that warm loaf of bread on her plate, neither of them knew it wasn't just a meal. It was the beginning of something far gentler. Trust. That trust was as fragile as the last rays of sunlight, as fleeting as the steam rising from warm bread. But it was enough to bridge two lives running side by side. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the lamp still burned, and in that soft glow, Jesse understood she had finally found a place where she belonged. Part 5, The First Winter Storm. The first wind of winter rolled down from the far mountains, carrying a knife-sharp chill. All of Wyoming turned gray. The sky seemed to lean low, heavy and threatening. On the prairie, brittle yellow grass snapped in the gusts, spinning into pale whirls of dust. The diamond Y herd bellowed hoarsely, huddling tight, their backs dusted with a thin coat of snow. Brody stood on the porch, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Black clouds were massing thick as a wall, swallowing the last of the light. He knew winter had come early this year, and if this storm truly broke, it could sweep everything away. Jesse stood behind him, clutching her worn shawl, the wind stinging her cheeks red. She had never seen a western winter strike so fiercely. The air smelled of cold and iron, of new snow so sharp it seemed to thicken the breath in her chest. "We need to bring the cattle in," Brody said, rough and brief. "If we don't, we'll lose half by nightfall." He turned toward the stables, and Jesse hurried after him. "Let me help," she said, her voice firm. "No, you stay here. Snow's coming. I can't sit still while you go out there alone." Brody stopped and glanced back. The wind whipped her hair, but her hazel eyes were clear, steady. He started to object, then exhaled and gave a short nod. "All right, but ride behind me. Don't break off." Minutes later, they were in the saddle and into the open. The sky tore with the howl of wind. The first flakes fell, soft as powder, and within moments thickened into a white curtain. Crosswinds lashed, bitter and blinding. Jessie hunched low, her scarf snapping behind her. Through the blur, she saw the herd dark shapes scattering in panic, their cries swallowed by the gale. "Drive 'em south," Brody shouted, his words ripped in half by the storm. They fanned out. Jessie urged her horse on, calling to the cattle, her shouts torn to tatters. She had never ridden in weather like this, but instinct and the dread of losing stock kept her moving. Whenever her mount slipped, she folded lower, eyes burning from the snow. The wind hit hard enough to topple a horse. A calf broke away toward a deep wash. Jessie saw it and, without thinking, yanked the reins and drove after it. She shouted, trying to turn it back, but a sudden gust roared up from behind. Her horse spooked, lost footing. It happened in an instant. A shriek split the wind, and then she and the horse tumbled down a snowy incline. The world spun, wind screaming, snow slashing, then everything went dark. Far off, Brody turned just in time to see her mount go down. Jesse, his voice tore into the storm. He hauled the reins and plunged that way, snow thickening by the heartbeat, covering tracks as soon as they were made. He swung down, legs sinking to his knees, his heart hammered. "Jesse," he shouted again, hoarse and raw, only the wind answered. He pushed forward, hands raking through drifts until his fingers found something soft. Her arm. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow from her body. Jessie's face was bloodless, her lips purpled, lashes crusted with ice. She was breathing barely, her breath thin as smoke. "You're all right, Jesse," he said, voice low but urgent. "I've got you. Hold on." He slid his arms beneath her and lifted. She felt weightless and cold as river ice. He pulled her tight against his chest, his heavy coat breaking the wind for them both, and started back one brutal step at a time into the storm. The gale hit him like a hammer. Each stride felt like wading through a white hell. He didn't know how long he walked, only that every time he thought he'd fall. He looked at her face, lashes frozen shut, hair stuck to her brow, and kept going. At last, the dim glow of a field cabin came through the whiteness. He kicked the door open and stepped inside. A faint warmth lingered from the old stove. He set her in a chair, tore off his gloves, and coaxed the fire back to life. Flames leapt, throwing gold across the timbered walls and onto her face, which slowly began to color. "Jesse, can you hear me?" He knelt, his large hand closing around hers. She didn't answer. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her, fed more wood to the fire. Heat bloomed. He warmed a cloth, wiped the melting snow from her hair, rubbed her small hands to bring the blood back. After a moment, she stirred, her eyelids fluttered, and the hazel gaze opened, dazed. "You!" "Hush," Brody said, a tightness catching in his throat. "Fool girl, you almost—" She tried a faint smile. "I didn't want the calf to die." He looked at her, angry and aching all at once, and found no words. At last, he exhaled. "And I didn't want to lose you." She didn't answer, only watched him. In the firelight, Brody's sun-browned, granite face had softened. In his eyes was something she'd never seen there before. Worry and a very human fear. He gathered her up and laid her on the small bed near the stove. She shivered once. He pulled the blankets higher and sat down beside her. The fire popped inside, its warm light washing their faces, one exhausted, one awaking to what could have been lost. Jessie watched the flames, her eyes glittering. "I thought I wouldn't wake up." "You're stronger than that," he said gently. "Don't forget you walked 100 miles just to stay alive." She tried a laugh, though her lips trembled. "You saved me." Brody's voice dropped. "Maybe you saved me first." She looked up, surprised. "Saved you before you came," he said, eyes on the fire. "This place was so quiet I figured I was fading out. I didn't talk, didn't smile. I couldn't remember the sound of a voice. Then you knocked, and after that, even the wind sounded different." Jessie said nothing. Tears slid slowly, not from pain, but from something warm and deep, a feeling she'd forgotten the name of. Brody leaned in to straighten the blanket. His hand brushed hers. Heat moved through her like a tide, driving the last of the chill away. She let her eyes close and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. He simply watched her drift into sleep in the soft, rose gold light of the fire, her hair tousled on the pillow, her lips parted like a quiet dream. Outside, the snow kept falling, but in the little cabin, the fire burned bright, shining over two wayward souls who had found each other in the storm of the land, and in the storms within themselves. When Brody's fingertips brushed her cheek, you could feel what was taking root more than pity, a tenderness awakening in a long-parched heart, out in the white world, where death can sit a breath away. He had carried her through the drifts, and the flame in that cabin became proof of something he hardly dared to name: kindness and the first embers of love. That night, the Diamond Y lay buried in snow, but from the small house on the prairie, a warm, golden light kept burning, defying winter itself. Part 6. The Flame in the Storm. Snow was still falling outside, not spinning up as before, but thicker now, whiter, draping the whole world. From the little window of the cabin, all Jessie could see was a blank white, blurred like a long dream with no end. Each time the wind swept past, the flakes whirled and danced, then vanished into the open air. The wind hissed softly along the plank walls, weaving with the steady crackle of wood in the stove. She woke to warmth and amber light, the air rich with the scent of herbal tea. It took a long moment for Jessie to remember where she was and what had just happened. She'd fallen from the horse, swallowed by snow, her breath stolen. Then a pair of arms had closed around her, pulling her out of the killing cold. Now, those same hands sat across from her, moving quietly, gently, adding more wood to the fire. Brody. He was still in his dark leather coat, half soaked, hair mussed and plastered to his brow, a few melted drops trailing over his sun-browned cheekbones. In the firelight, his face looked both hard and kind. There was something in his gaze so calm it nearly brought her to tears. "You're awake," he said softly, his low voice wrapped in a woolen hush. Jessie tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness rolled through her. Brody was there in an instant, steadying her, his palm warm against the small of her back. Heat spread from his touch, and she trembled. "Don't push it," he murmured. "Slower now. You're deep cold. Just sit still." She nodded, fingers gripping the wool blanket wrapped around her. The little room shivered whenever wind struck the door. Beside the stove, a pot of tea steamed, mint and ginger slipping into every corner of the cabin. Brody poured some into a chipped clay cup and held it out. Drink. Warm yourself. Jesse lifted the cup with both hands. The heat seeped through the blanket to her skin. She closed her eyes for a breath, drawing the warmth in. When she looked up, his gaze was still on her, not distant or guarded, but holding a careful, gentle watch. "You went out looking for me?" she asked, hoarse, barely more than a breath. Brody sat in the chair across from her, the firelight turning his pale blue eyes the color of thawing ice. He didn't answer right away. He turned the cup in his hands, then gave a small nod. "Couldn't leave you out there." Simple words, but more comforting than any speech. Jessie lowered her head, her fingers circling the cup. Over the wind's moan, his voice felt like a rope tied to her heart, keeping her from slipping back into the empty place she knew too well. Brody stood and fed the stove. The flames rose, filling the cabin with light. The wall planks were old and scarred, but the glow made the place warmer than any room she'd ever known. He leaned against the hearth, eyes on her, a small figure tucked into a blanket, worn but finally at peace. "You're reckless," he said quietly. "Going out in a storm for a few head of cattle." Jessie let out a thin, breathy laugh. "I just didn't want what you worked for to be lost." "Cattle can die," he answered. "You can't." She lifted her eyes, and in the light, their gazes met. In his, she saw fear not of the storm, but of losing a person. He came closer and sat on the low stool near the bed. A silence stretched, the wind whispering at the door. He looked at her and said, carefully, as though every word might break something fragile, "You're safe now." Jessie breathed in, like she'd just heard an ancient prayer. "You're safe now." 3 ordinary words, but to her, a miracle. She had lived a life on the run, in fear, in hard hands and harder eyes. Safe was something she had never had, never dared to trust. And yet here, in the wild, in a small wooden room in the heart of a storm, someone had said it to her in a voice so steady and true that she wanted to believe. Her breath shuddered. Tears slid before she could stop them. Brody saw, but said nothing. He simply reached out, and with the back of his rough hand brushed one tear from her cheek. The touch was so gentle she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Don't cry," he said softly. "You're alive. That's what matters most. But if you hadn't found me," she faltered, choking on the words. "If you hadn't," Brody shook his head. "I'll always find you, Jessie, storm or dark." She bit her lip and fell quiet. The fire climbed higher, light wavering over their faces. Time seemed to stop. Outside was a white world where death waited close. In here, only life remained fragile, warm, real. After a while, Brody stood, fetched a dry coat, and tucked it around her. "You need rest," he said. "I'm staying here tonight. By morning, the storm will break. You're not going back. No, I won't leave you again." The words were light, but they felt like a vow. He pulled a chair near the stove and sat, head bowed toward the flames. She kept her back to the wall, hands cupping a cooling tea. Smoke and ginger scented the room, turning everything gentle and a little dreamlike. "How long have you lived alone?" Jessie asked quietly. "Too long to count." "No one at all?" "No," he said with a wry smile. "Just horses and wind. Honest company never lies." She smiled faintly. "I think loneliness is a kind of betrayal too." He lifted his head, studying her. "Betrayal of who?" "Yourself," she whispered. "When you stop hoping, when you stop believing someone might still care." Brody was silent. Firelight softened the strong lines of his face. "You still believe, don't you?" "I don't know," she said, eyes lowered. "But when you said, 'You're safe now,' I wanted to—" He didn't answer. He only drew the blanket higher over her shoulders. The gesture was so simple, so unthinking, that her heart stumbled and she hardly dared breathe. The wind rose again. The roof timbers gave a small shiver. Brody checked the latch and returned, his voice low. "I'll keep the fire going till dawn." "Sleep?" She smiled. "You're not sleeping." "No, I never rest easy while a storm's still out there." He sat again by the stove. The flames mirrored in his eyes like hidden stones shining in the dark. Jessie lay on her side, watching him through the firelight, afraid to blink in case the moment slipped away. After a while, she spoke, her words nearly lost to the wind. "I used to be afraid of everyone." "Why?" "Because everyone wanted something from me, money, work, or worse. No one just wanted me to exist." Brody didn't turn. He only said, very softly, "I don't want anything from you." "Jessie." "Nothing. I want you to live here as yourself." She looked at him, breath catching. Outside, the snow muffled every sound. Yet inside the cabin, his words kept ringing on. Now she understood what set him apart wasn't only strength or kindness. It was the way he saw her. Not as a burden, not as a possession, but as a person who deserved to live and be at peace. The night wore on. The stove flame burned tired, but steadfast. Now and then Brody fed it, and the light leapt up again, revealing his big, work-rough hands that, when they touched her, were gentle as morning wind. Drowsiness crept over Jesse. Just before her eyes closed, she heard him speaking, very low, as if to himself. "You're safe now, Jesse, I promise." A simple promise, needing no proof. But on that storm-tossed night, it was everything. She slept deeply, her breathing evening out. Outside, the snow still fell, but the wind had eased. Brody watched her for a while, then leaned back, weary. He saw again the moment he'd found her in the drifts, the image etched and replaying. He hadn't understood. At first, why fear had seized him so hard, why he dreaded that she might melt away beneath his hands like snow. Now, watching her there, he knew the fear wasn't death, it was loss, because for the first time in years, he had something to lose. By morning, the snow would stop. They would ride back to the ranch, where life would pick up its familiar rhythm work. Cattle, sun and wind. But tonight, in this small wooden room, the world had narrowed to two people, one who had lost her faith, and one who thought he needed no one. And in the white storm beyond these walls, with the fire burning and tea steaming, they had found each other not as rescuer and rescued, but as two souls brave enough to believe in gentleness again. That small flame, in a frozen world, was what held them, both of them, and the human goodness left within them, the flame in the storm, and the words, light as a breath, that would echo in her heart. "You're safe now." Part 7, Spring in Creekide. The snow was gone. The last white patches sank into the earth, revealing tender shoots of grass rising after the long winter. Water slid off the hillsides into small rills, whispering through stone and catching sunlight like silver ribbons. The spring wind carried warmth and the first birdsong, and all of Wyoming seemed newly awake. Diamond Y Ranch stirred with fresh life. Cattle grazed lazily along the slopes. The horses ran the fence line, hooves flicking clods of damp earth. In the big house, Jesse threw the windows wide to let the sun pour in. Outside, Brody tightened the cinch on his black gelding, readying for a ride into the town of Creekide, the first time in months they would leave the ranch's quiet boundary together. "You sure you want to go?" Brody asked, tugging the saddle snug. Jesse smiled, a bright mix of eagerness and shyness in her eyes. "It's been so long since I've seen a market. I'd like some fabric and a little thread. Creekide's not much for noise," he said. Voice easy, but if you want it, he paused, a small smile forming. "Let's go." Jesse climbed up into the wagon seat, her simple dress lifting lightly in the wind. Brody took the reins. Sunlight washed his shoulders, and his weathered face looked easier than usual. They rolled away from the ranch, wheels bumping over new green grass and through trees just budding out. On the road, the air smelled of wet earth. A brook ran somewhere close, singing over stone. Jesse sat with her fingers twined, watching as the colors changed. Broad fields, a few wooden roofs scattered across the valley. Then the dirt roads funneling into Creekide, a small town tucked in a bowl of hills, kitchen smoke drifting up and a church bell carrying on the breeze. The market had been stirring since early morning. Folks clustered at the stalls, cloth and ironware, bread loaves, apple cider, and spring garlands braided from dried grass. The sight warmed Jesse. Voices and laughter tangled with horses' whinnies and the spice of cinnamon and honey, a world she'd thought she'd lost for good. Brody tied the team outside Henderson's general store and reached a hand up. Careful steps high. Jesse set her hand in his and climbed down. The warmth of his palm, broad and steady, held hers for only a heartbeat, yet it brought back the same safety she'd felt the night of the blizzard. They stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed. The place smelled of new fabric, brown sugar, and soap. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman with silvered hair and an apron, smiled when she saw them. "Well now, Brody, it's been a spell since you came to town. And this is—" Brody hesitated, glanced toward Jesse. She went still, waiting. He answered in that calm, certain way of his, "This is Jesse Keller, housekeeper at Diamond Y Ranch." Housekeeper. The words drifted through the room like a light breeze. Yet Jesse's heart tightened at their weight. Not help, not a girl staying on, but housekeeper, a title with standing, enough to give her a place in his world. Enough that this town would see her differently. Mrs. Henderson beamed. "Well then, Miss Keller, you work for Brody. Good heavens, you must have a touch of magic to brighten that place up. I hear Diamond Y is tidy as a model ranch these days." Jesse flushed. I just do my best, ma'am. Brody folded his arms, watching her from the side with a quiet pride. Like a man admiring something precious, he didn't want the world to notice too quickly. Jesse picked out a few bolts, one pale blue, one cream, and several spools of thread. While she bent to look over the shelves, Brody helped Mrs. Henderson carry crates to the back. From that angle, the shopkeeper leaned in and murmured to Jesse, "Mr. Yates doesn't bring folks in with him. You're the first in a long while." Jesse looked up, startled, then smiled it away. But her heartbeat quickened all the same. When they left the store, Brody set the parcels in the wagon. Jesse settled on the seat, taking in the town's small bustle. Across the way, a few men lifted their chins in greeting. One called, laughing, "Didn't know Yates finally found himself some company." Brody only arched a brow and returned a rare, brief smile. Jesse turned aside, but his glance lingered on her. They rolled down the main street, past the smithy and the churchyard where children played. Brody stopped at a pie stand. The young seller offered fresh apple pies, still warm. He bought 2 and handed one to Jesse. "Do you like apple pie?" "I do, but it's been a long time." "Then we start again now." She bit in. Sweet and tart met on her tongue. Cinnamon rose warm in the air. She looked up at him. "I forgot what this felt like, standing among people, tasting something sweet, and not being afraid." His gaze softened. "You don't have to be afraid here." "I know," she whispered, voice trembling, "but hearing you say it makes it warmer." At noon, they stopped by a stream outside town. Water ran over stones, catching the sky. Brody loosened the horses and let them graze. Jessie sat on a flat rock, thumb stroking the pale blue cloth she'd bought, her eyes far away. "I never thought I'd have a day like this," she said softly. "Like what?" "Seeing the world without the world looking back with scorn. Having someone tell others I'm part of his life," she trailed off. Brody came and sat beside her. "Creekide's a small town, but it remembers," he said. "They'll remember today that a woman named Jessie Keller came here with me." She turned. His eyes met hers. In the gentle spring wind, the space between them was no more than a breath. He didn't say more. He only looked at her for a long time, then tilted his head and spoke low and plain. "You make me proud, Jessie." Time stopped. Jessie lowered her lashes to hide the smile trembling at the corner of her mouth. A few loose strands of her hair lifted and brushed his shoulder. They sat in stillness, listening to the stream, to the wind sliding through grass. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, and the season of spring. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sky had slipped toward honey-colored dusk. Sunlight poured along the ridges and turned the fields to amber. Jessie cradled the bundle of fabric. A quiet flame kindled in her chest. She was no longer a wanderer begging a night's shelter on the open range. No longer the lost girl, the unwanted, the one afraid of being driven off. She was Jessie Keller, housekeeper of Diamond Y Ranch, the woman Brody Yates had named before the whole town. That night, as she folded the fabric and set it in the wooden drawer, Brody paused in the doorway. "We'll need to mend the stable roof tomorrow," he said. "Yes, I'll set aside nails and a hammer." He nodded, then added, "Those Creekide apple pies were good." Jessie laughed. "I think that's because someone knows how to split things fair." He gave her a quick smile and moved on. When the door eased shut, Jessie laid a hand on the blue cloth, her heart bright and busy. Outside, the spring wind swept the wide grasslands. For the first time, she knew what it was to belong not from force, not from debt, but from being valued. And in her chest, something quiet took root, a trust that perhaps this spring was not only the earth's season, but the first true spring of her heart. Part 8, The Confession by the Stream. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, but when it did, even the dry land seemed to wake from sleep. Grass spread soft and green across the hills. Wildflowers burst open in yellow, violet, and white, spilling all the way down to the creek. The water ran clear, singing over smooth stones, reflecting the sky's glass blue light. Eden's Corner. The little bend in the creek. Brody always called his heaven was still and bright that afternoon. The breeze smelled of grass and blossom. Beneath the drooping willows, Jessie sat on a flat rock, bare feet dipping into the cool water. She smiled faintly at her reflection in the ripples, a face now alive. No longer the hollow-eyed girl who once stood lost on a St. Louis road, but a woman who had found steadiness and peace. Behind her came a familiar, heavy step. Brody. He walked toward her, sleeves rolled high, hair tousled by the wind. Sunlight slanted through his shoulders, scattering across the water in trembling lines. "Skipping work again?" he asked, a teasing note in his low voice. Jessie turned with a small laugh. "I just wanted to see if the ice was gone." "It's gone," he said, "but the water's cold." I know. Her smile brightened, her eyes glinting. I just like to feel it. He sat beside her, leaning back on one hand. For a time, neither spoke. They listened to the water and the wind. Far off, horses grazed lazily. The soft jingle of their bells carried through the air like a quiet tune for the gentle day. Eden's Corner, Jesse murmured. Still watching the creek? Sounds like something from the Bible. My father named it, Brody said. He used to say every man needs a place that reminds him who he is. For him, this was that place. And for you, he hesitated. I used to think I didn't need a place at all. But maybe I was wrong. She lifted her gaze to him, soft and questioning. Why's that? Brody turned. Sunlight caught his face, tanned, lined, his eyes deep as still water. He looked at her so long the wind seemed to stop. Because that place isn't land, he said quietly. It's a person. The words struck her heart like a gentle blow. Jesse looked away, eyes on the rippling light. The wind brushed her hair forward, a few strands crossing her cheek. Brody raised a hand and tucked them behind her ear. His fingers grazed her skin. She shivered. Jesse, he said, voice steady and low. Before you came, there was nothing here but silence. I worked, slept again and again. Not hurting, but not living either. When my father died, I thought I'd run out of reasons to come home at all. He drew a breath. The creek murmured on. She could hear her own heartbeat in time with it. Then you showed up. He went on, thin, stubborn, with eyes that looked straight ahead even when you were scared. You brought back something I didn't know I'd lost. Jesse, he smiled faintly, sadness flickering in the curve of his mouth. You've given me life again. The words were light as spring wind, but they rolled through her like thunder. She turned toward him, eyes shining. He didn't look away. He met her gaze open, unguarded. In that look she saw everything. His loneliness, his gratitude, his tenderness, and the love he'd never dared to name. Brody, she whispered, voice trembling. You don't have to say that just because you saved me. He shook his head. Not because I saved you, Jesse, because you saved me first. You made me remember I still have a heart. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned aside, but his hand found hers where it rested on her knee. She flinched, then didn't pull away. His grip was light, no claim, just the quiet promise of I'm here. The wind rippled across the field, swaying the wildflowers. Jesse looked down at their joined hands, her heart unsteady. I don't think I deserve that, she said softly. I'm just someone who ran away. I have nothing to give back. You do, Brody said, eyes glowing like firelight. You have a heart stronger than anyone I've ever known, and that's enough. She laughed through tears. You make me want to believe in something again. Then believe, he murmured. Believe that even the lost can still find each other. She looked at him for a long moment, then breathed his name. Brody, he answered without words, only with a gaze so close their breaths touched. And in that fragile silence, between the water's murmur and the scent of spring, Jesse reached up and clasped his hand tight. The hush that followed wasn't awkward. It was the peace of two souls who had finally found each other after too many storms. Sunlight shimmered on the water, framing their entwined hands. Brody bent his head slightly, voice low and sure, as if afraid to break the stillness. Jesse, I don't know what the future holds, but if I could choose, I'd want to wake each morning hearing your voice in my house, not as someone who works for me, but as someone who lives beside me, shares the hard days, shares the laughter. Her tears came again, but this time they were bright with joy. You don't have to say more, she whispered. I understand. They sat there for a long while. The breeze drifted, rich with the scent of sun-warmed grass. Beneath their feet, the creek at Eden's Corner flowed clear and easy, like the feeling quietly growing between two hearts that had once been hollow. Jesse leaned her head against his shoulder. Brody said nothing, but the small smile at his lips was warm as the season itself. He wrapped an arm around her and held her not tightly, just enough to be certain she was real. Far off, birds dipped low to the water, their wings tracing ripples across the mirrored light. The world shimmered under the setting sun, and in its heart sat two people, no vows, no witnesses, only the stream and wildflowers as proof of their rebirth. Because sometimes, in the harshest wilderness, love doesn't arrive with grand words or promises. It comes in a single touch, a steady look, and one simple truth spoken softly enough to reach the soul. You've given me life again. And so it was here in Eden's Corner, where nature renewed itself. Two weary hearts found the springtime of their own. Part 9, the wedding at Creekide. That morning, sunlight poured gently over the Creekide valley. Golden as honey, the last of the mist lifted slowly, revealing the dirt road that wound toward a small wooden church set amid fields of wildflowers. The church bell rang clear and bright, echoing across the hills, calling the townsfolk to witness something rare, the wedding of Brody Yates. the loneliest cowboy in all of Wyoming. The church was small, but it shone in the spring morning. Light streamed through colored glass, painting stripes of red, gold, and blue across the wooden floor. Daisies and lavender lined the aisle, their scent soft in the air. Mrs. Henderson bustled happily at the refreshment table, arranging apple pies and coffee. Children darted about, giggling, stealing glances at the bride Jessie Keller, the woman everyone knew, though today they looked at her with new eyes, full of affection and quiet awe. In the little room behind the church, Jessie stood before a wooden mirror. She wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, the very fabric bought on that first trip to Creekide. It was simple, trimmed with white lace at the cuffs and hem, but fitted her perfectly, graceful in its modesty. Her hair was pinned up, a few loose curls softening her face. Old Mrs. Isaura, the former housekeeper of the ranch, smoothed the hem and said with a smile, "You're beautiful, Jesse." Brody won't believe his eyes. Jessie laughed, cheeks pink. "I just hope I don't trip walking down that aisle." "You've survived a snowstorm. My dear, you'll manage a few steps." They both laughed, light as silver bells. Outside, the organ began to play. Brody stood at the far end of the aisle, dressed in a plain black suit, his cowboy hat hanging from one hand. His beard was neatly trimmed, his dark hair combed back. His face still held its rugged calm, but in his blue eyes burned a brightness that only true love could kindle. When the church doors opened, every sound fell away. Jessie stepped forward, her gown whispering softly. All eyes turned to her, and in the colored light, she seemed touched by the morning itself. Brody drew a deep breath. His gaze followed her every step, every heartbeat. When she reached him, he extended his hand. She placed hers in his small, warm, trembling, and he held it tight, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. Father Wilson stood between them, his voice steady and kind. "Today, before God and those who love you, we witness the joining of two souls, one who found love within solitude, and one who found a home within kindness." Jessie listened, feeling as if she were hearing her own story told aloud. She remembered that first day at the ranch gate, the wind whipping her hair, her voice shaking as she begged for work just to survive. Now, those same hands that once trembled in fear were steady in the grasp of the man she loved. Brody turned to her, his eyes bright in the candlelight. Father Wilson handed him a ring, a simple gold band etched with small flowers. Brody spoke, his voice low but sure, like an oath made to the earth itself. "Jessie Keller, I lived half a life in silence, thinking my heart had nothing left to give. Then you came bringing breath and laughter and a reason to come home each day. With this ring, I give you everything I am, my heart, my soul, and my life." Jessie's throat tightened. Father Wilson handed her the other ring. Her hand trembled as she slid it onto Brody's finger. Her voice, soft but clear, flowed like a spring. "Brody Yates, you pulled me from the cold, but more than that, you taught me I was worth saving, worth loving. With this ring, I am not only your wife, I am the one who will keep the fire of Diamond Y with you through every season." Father Wilson smiled, his voice full of warmth. "I now pronounce you husband and wife, in the sight of God, of the earth, the wind, and every heart gathered here." Brody looked at her, slowly leaning forward. She lifted her gaze, eyes wet with joy. And there, in the sunlight streaming through the windows, he kissed her lightly, reverently, like a promise spoken in breath rather than words. Applause erupted. Laughter filled the church. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes. Children jumped and cheered. "About time that ranch heard laughter again," she said, grinning through tears. Brody and Jessie turned toward the doors. As they stepped onto the church steps, handfuls of wildflower petals rained down around them. Jessie's smile was radiant, the kind of smile Brody knew he'd carry in his heart forever. He held her hand as they walked toward the waiting wagon. Townsfolk lined the path, calling blessings, waving, smiling. Jessie turned once to look back, the little church glowing in sunlight, the place where she had given her heart and received a whole life in return. "On the wagon," Brody spoke softly, still dazed by joy. "The day you came to Diamond Y, I told you something. I don't think I understood it then." Jessie tilted her head, smiling. "What was it you said?" He squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with love. "I said I didn't need a servant. I needed a wife. And now I have one." Jessie laughed through her tears, leaning her head on his shoulder. The wagon wheels rolled down the red dirt road, spring petals swirling around them like rain. Once, she had been a girl begging for a meal and a roof. Now she rode toward a home built of love, trust, and light, a future she had never dared to dream. Above them, the sky over Creekide stretched blue and boundless. The church bell kept ringing, etching their story into the hills, a story of two lost souls who found each other in the wilderness and built a home from the ashes of loneliness. And when the wagon vanished beyond the ridge, only the wind remained, whispering the words that had once begun it all and had, at last, come true. I don't need a servant. I need a wife. Part 10, The House by the Valley. Dawn spread across Diamond Y Ranch. First light poured over the ridgelines, gilding the dew-wet grass until the whole valley gleamed as if spring itself had laid a warm hand on it. The air was clean, sweet with hay and fresh milk threaded with rooster calls and the far-off lowing of cattle. Yet above all those familiar sounds rose the laughter of children, clear, bell-like, and bright as happiness itself. Jesse stood on the porch, one hand resting on a wooden post, gazing out over the pasture. Her hair had grown longer. In the sunlight, a few silver strands showed. But her face held the same gentle warmth it had the first morning he found her in the blizzard. A dusting of flour marked her apron proof that she'd been up early baking bread, as always. But now she paused, simply to take in the sight that filled her heart. Brody, out there in the sunshine, playing with their two children. Jacob, 8 years old, with his father's blue eyes, chased the yearlings along the fence line. Elizabeth, 3 years younger, laughed as Brody swung her up and around in a bright whirl. His old cowboy hat sat cocked to one side, dark hair mussed by the wind, their daughter's laughter chiming across the grass like silver bells. Jesse smiled. That picture, a once lonely man leaning down to kiss his little girl's brow. Strong and tender, made her chest feel so full she thought that if she drew one more breath, joy might spill right out of her ribs. Brody set Elizabeth down and whispered something that sent the child into peals of laughter. He glanced back and caught Jesse's eyes on the porch. A small, quiet smile touched his mouth, the same low, steady smile she'd always known, but now softened by the ease of belonging. He raised a hand and called over the breeze. Coffee ready, Mrs. Yates? Jesse laughed. It is, but if you let them eat all the bread. You're baking tonight. His laughter drifted across the yard, light as wind. Jesse watched him lift Elizabeth onto the pony while Jacob tugged his sleeve, clamoring to ride on his own. It was all so simple, and within that simplicity, an entire life. A little later they came in together. Jesse gathered Elizabeth into her arms, wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, and kissed her brow. Brody bent to press a familiar, feather-soft kiss to Jesse's hair, an old gesture, and yet it still set her heart trembling, like that first time by the fire. They're growing fast, she murmured as they stepped onto the porch. Too fast, he said, resting a hand on her shoulder. Feels like yesterday I could hold Jacob in one arm. Now he wants the reins. She laughed. He's more like you than I ever expected. Brody arched a brow, teasing. That's so. And Elizabeth, Jesse glanced at the little girl chasing butterflies in the sun. She has your eyes, but her mother's heart. Brody chuckled and kissed Jesse's forehead. Perfect. Then they sat on the steps by the small table where 2 cups of coffee steamed. The rich scent drifted out into the breeze. Far off, the herd moved slow and easy. Ranch hands lifted their hats in greeting. Peace lay so thick over everything that time itself seemed to slow. Do you remember the first day I came to the ranch? Jesse asked, half teasing, half wistful. Brody smiled toward the horizon. I do. A thin girl with dust on her face, standing at the gate, saying with a shaky voice, I only need shelter and a meal. Sir. Oh, Jesse laughed and gave his arm a playful nudge. You remember my voice too? I do, because I knew, right then. You weren't just asking for work. You were asking to live. She went quiet, then rested her head on his shoulder. And I remember what you said. I don't need a servant. I need a wife. I thought you were out of your mind, but now I see you weren't only speaking to me. You were speaking to yourself. Brody's hand closed gently over hers. Maybe so, but there's one thing I know for certain. He paused, meeting her eyes. I've never once regretted saying it. Jesse's gaze shone in the sun. And I, she said softly, have never once regretted trusting you. They sat silent for a while, listening to the wind pass under the eaves, to the children's laughter beyond the porch. Light slanted through the doorway, laying a quiet glow over 2 faces that had weathered blizzards and fear and loneliness, now warmed by simple peace. Behind the house, the maple Brody planted their first year had grown tall. Its leaves murmured in a gentle shade that fell across the porch. Beneath it hung the little swing Jacob built for his sister, always moving a little when the wind rose. Jesse watched it and whispered, maybe this is the dream I never dared to dream. A home, laughter, and a calm morning. Brody smiled. Not just a dream, Jesse. This is our life. He stood and held out a hand. She took it. Together they stepped down into the yard. Sunlight stretched long, painting their shadows on the ground. Jacob ran to catch his mother's hand. Elizabeth clung to her father's shirt. The four of them walked toward the stables, where the day's light danced along the old wooden roof. Laughter rose and thinned into the wind. Thin clouds drifted, the sky opened wide, as if to gather them all in. From a girl who once stood at a ranch gate begging for a place to sleep, to a woman with family, love, and a life her journey had come full circle. No grand trophies, no blazing glory, only courage and kindness, which had led them home. Jesse turned back to the small clapboard house in the valley. Smoke lifted from the chimney, straight up into the blue. She smiled and squeezed Brody's hand. "We've come so far, Brody," she said. He nodded, his eyes gentle. "We have, but it's not how far we've gone that matters. It's that we went together." The wind moved through the grass, sweet with the scent of fresh cuttings and bird song. The sun climbed higher, lighting the whole valley where their home shone like a quiet promise in the wild. After everything, love is what shows us the way back. And in that bright scene, you could see Brody and Jesse with their 2 children crossing the meadow, their shadows long on the earth, mingling with the morning light. From 2 lonely souls, they had made a shelter, a house by the valley where tired hearts could finally rest. Sunrise over Diamond Y. Morning washed Wyoming in gold. The first rays slipped over the eastern hills and poured across the broad fields of grass. Dew clung to the ground. The breeze smelled of earth and green things, a breath of new life. Diamond Y Ranch woke horses shifting in their stalls, cattle calling far away, a feather of smoke rising from the small wooden house tucked in the valley. On the porch, Brody Yates stood beside Jesse. He wore an old wool sweater. His work-rough hands threaded with hers. Silver now touched his hair. But his eyes held the same clear blue they'd had the first evening she saw him step from the stable. Jessie leaned into his shoulder, her breath warm and steady in the gentle air. Before them, the meadow ran on and on. Early light turned everything honey gold, the fence rails, the maple by the door, even the faint hoofprints in the damp soil. Once, there at that gate, a frightened girl had begged for work. A quiet cowboy had answered with words that changed her world. "Do you remember?" Jessie asked, her voice blending with the wind. Brody nodded, a low smile playing at his mouth. Every detail. The wind, the dust, your eyes that day. "I was so afraid." "I was too," he said. "Afraid of something else, afraid I'd let you go." She laughed softly and squeezed his hand. Far off, their 2 children rode along the creek bank, their laughter ringing in the valley. The sight made Jessie close her eyes and feel peace move through her like warmth. "We really did come far," she murmured. "We did," Brody said gently. From a winter storm to a spring, they fell quiet, watching the sun lift over the ridge. Each beam was a memory. The quiet days she stirred the pot while he listened by the door. The storm nights when he kept the fire alive. The afternoon at Eden's Corner when he'd said, "You've given me life again." All of it gathered in the light, woven into the story of a lifetime. The grass stirred. Old echoes moved with the breeze hoofbeats, calls, laughter. Jesse turned to Brody, the light washing his face. In his eyes, she still saw what she'd seen on that first day. Honesty, goodness, and a love that needed no oath to endure. She spoke softly, like a prayer given back to her own life. "In the harsh West, love and kindness are the only roof." Brody squeezed her hand and nodded. "And we built that roof." Jesse, they stood a long while, watching the sun climb, light flowing over the pasture like a golden sea. Birds rose from the trees, tracing free arcs against the sky. Jessie rested her head on his shoulder and looked toward the horizon where beginnings and endings meet. Below, their shadows stretched long on the ground, merging with the brightness of the day. Their story born of a plea and a strange sentence closed with the gentle hush of 2 hearts at home. Diamond Y Ranch blazed in the early sun. And there, on that porch in the wide west, 2 people once lost stood hand in hand, with nothing left to say. Only peace, only light, only the breath of new life. In the harsh West, love and kindness are the only roof. Leave a comment and rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next Wild West ride.